So I was invited to talk to you about leadership in academia on the grounds that some of you might actually sort of want to do this thing called leadership. So I was contacted by Sophie Roberts and invited to come and present to you on this on the grounds that I have this esteemed title, Professor of Leadership and Business Education. So let's hope that I actually know something about this, and let's hope that I'm going to talk about something that's useful to you. Those are my details. I've got lots of slides. I may not make it through all of the slides. That's fine. I've put the slide deck together as a resource for you to be able to take away at the end of this retreat, and for you to refer to some of the things in a bit more detail. You can use Google. It's good for anything. And have a look at some of the things that I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail after I've finished. You can also contact me as well, so I'm happy if you want to email me. You can tweet me, that Twitter thing. I periodically go on there and have a look at whether somebody's posted something up there or not. I'm not a rabid user of it, but I do use it periodically. Okay, so this is roughly what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to talk about some of what I do and where I am from and why I have been invited to talk to you today, and hopefully establish the fact that actually I do know something about some of what I'm talking about. Let's hope anyway. I'm going to talk about leadership in academia, in universities, what it's like, why it might be a maze, and some of the things that you might need to know in order to navigate some of that. Now, some of you may already have quite a lot of experience at navigating that maze. You may have tripped over some of the politics in academia. You may have realized that people who have got positions of leadership are not necessarily those who are doing the leading, and welcome to the real world. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of that too. I'm going to give you a very quick gander through some leadership theory. This is the textbook stuff that we teach the students. It's a little bit boring, but it gives you a bit of background of sort of where we come from. But the stuff that I hope is going to be really useful to you is some of the stuff around the differences between leadership and management, and how you can develop yourself as a leader at any point. And that's something that I've called in previous publications leading from any chair. And I'm going to hopefully give you some pointers for some things to think about in terms of where you might want to go with your career, okay, and what you might need to be doing and thinking about and planning at this point in an early career position. Okay, so Professor of Leadership and Business Education at Brunel University in London. So we're based in London, we're not based in Bristol. We often have that confusion with the name Brunel. We're actually based near Heathrow Airport, which is kind of handy for me in terms of getting up here today because I needed to come up and back in one day. My research interests are around academic leadership and compassionate leadership. Compassion not being a woohoo, touchy-feely kind of thing, but compassion actually being we've got to deal with some hard stuff, but we can do this better, and we can put people at the centre of this. I do stuff around consultancy work. I do executive education, which is actually why I need to get back today, this evening, because we've got an exec ed programme going on. And I believe it's important for everybody, whatever you do, to have an overriding principle to give you direction in your career. And mine is that I aim to bring humanity back into leadership and into higher education. So that's where I'm focused. It's also worth saying, this just gives you a little bit of background. I started out some 26 years ago on a traditional sort of career path in academia, in a business school, doing a PhD, had a role as a teaching assistant. And then gradually, as I progressed in that career, I got a bit bored and I wanted to go and do some different stuff. And I actually moved into research and development. So I actually spent about 10 years of my career working with you guys, okay? People in your position with PhD students, postdoctoral researchers, principal investigators and PhD supervisors. And I worked at Queen Mary, first of all, in London, and then at King's College London before I moved to Brunel and eventually moved back into, picked up sort of the tatters of my academic career, put them back together again and embarked back in a business school. But by that point, I had already started on this journey of trying to understand academic leadership and leadership in universities. And it started when I was working with PhD students and postdocs, because I could see all these people around me who had progressed to leadership positions. And one of the things I really wanted to know from them was what was it that they wished they had known at the start of their leadership role that they knew now. So it kick-started a whole load of research around what would it be useful for early career researchers to know before they embark upon moving up the hierarchy, taking on leadership positions, moving into positions of management. So it sort of, I disappeared down several rabbit holes from that question, really. So from there, I've designed and conducted 3 studies into different areas of academic leadership. And I have to look back at the slide because I think I'm having trouble these days actually remembering what I've done. And the first one was a funded project by the Leadership Foundation for Higher Education, which is now part of Advance HE, if you've come across that body. And that was entitled Developing the Next Generation. And for that, we interviewed a number of people in leadership positions across different universities. And that's the results of that. I'm going to show you some of the quotes a little bit later. But that's actually in a free Creative Commons licensed resource that you can download, and it's linked to at a later point. So that might be useful for you to go and have a look at. Then I had a look at how people progressed from what's known as a third space background. So in universities, we like to distinguish between academics and then this ghastly term, non-academics, okay? Which is an awful term which I try not to use because I don't like to define people by what they are not. So non-academics, or professional services staff, academics, but there's actually this whole raft of people who occupy what we used to call academic-related roles, and who often move into those roles after having done their PhD. So it's actually an active career choice for a lot of people. And you will find those people in things like researcher development, educational development. So you may actually have contact with those kinds of people in your universities. So I was interested in their career progressions because there's a lot that actually doesn't get talked about there. But that's an area that is slightly less related, I think, to a lot of people in the room. And then I've got a project at the moment which is funded by the British Academy and the Leverhulme Trust, looking at the role of heads of department, academic heads of department in universities. So that just gives you a bit about them. The current one that we're working on, we've just interviewed 70 heads of department across universities across the 4 nations of the UK. And we're currently looking at the motivations as to why people take on a head of department role and their experiences of using power in that role as well. So lots of stuff there that sort of is going on around why people move into leadership roles, what they do in those roles, and how they actually move out or into those roles as well, so entering and exiting those roles. Okay, so why? Why is this of interest to anybody? Okay, so it's interesting because actually there's relatively little research about it for the first, from the first perspective. The second thing is that most academics achieve promotion into these roles based on their research and prestige factors, not because they are actually any good at leading anything or managing any people in any way whatsoever that might be considered to be effective or even nice. Not that I'm speaking from experience. So We have an interest in these people because actually they occupy very influential spaces and they influence a lot of people. So you may have had, sadly, some difficult experiences in your university where you've rubbed up against people, policies, politics, money, any of those kinds of things, and you've found that actually, there can be quite a bit of unpleasantness around that. The other thing is that when we look at the profiles of people who are in leadership positions, we've clearly got some equity and diversity and inclusivity issues, and we actually need to do something about that too. So there are some very, very good reasons why looking at what happens in leadership in universities might be a good idea. Academics in management positions. I am going to distinguish between leadership and management in a minute, but academics in management positions constitute what we call in the social science literature hybrid managers. In other words, they are people who have a professional identity as an academic who then take on a management role. Those of you who are clinicians may be familiar with that in the healthcare setting as well. It's quite common in the healthcare setting. But most of the research has focused on healthcare. There's actually relatively little looking at this particular issue in universities. And as a result, what happens is that you can get some dissatisfaction and jarring between that professional identity, that need to carry on doing research, the love of the research, and the managerial requirements of the role. So we think it's quite an interesting thing to do. It's also worth bearing in mind that UK higher education is a major contributor to the UK economy. So in 2011, UKHE contributed £73 billion to the UK economy and employed over 378,000 people. That's a lot of people who are affected by managers and leaders within higher education. That's a lot of money that is in the system, that's in the economy, that is being managed by these people. And we need to do it better. We have a responsibility to do it better. Universities are major recipients of public funding, and at the moment, some of the management, frankly, is a bit not great. Should we just say that? Okay. So I think it's important to just have a look at some of the terms. It might be a maze in academia, and I've sort of posited this in several talks that I've given about leadership in academia. It may well be considered to be a maze because we don't make distinctions between leadership and management, and we should. And in fact, I would go so far as to say we actually lead people in the wrong direction by selling them a position that claims to be leadership and actually turns out to be management. We'll have a look at that in a minute. There is leading from any chair. So regardless of what level you are at in the organisation, you can show some leadership. You have the opportunity to be able to step up to leadership wherever you are in the organisation. And we actually have an expectation of people to be able to do that too. So that's something that we actually have an expectation of. There's leading, therefore, without direct management authority. So we ask people to do things, and we ask them to be able to influence others and negotiate with others and persuade others and get results through other people, but we don't actually put them into a position of authority where they've got management authority. In fact, one of the biggest quotes, the most frequent quotes I ever heard in doing leadership sessions with postdoctoral researchers was, "But I don't have any line management authority. How can I do this stuff when I don't have any line management authority?" Let me tell you something. It doesn't change that much when you've got your open-ended contract and you're in a department somewhere, because you're always being asked to take on this role or that role without any line management authority, and you've got to be able to get people to do things. So it's an important skill to be able to learn early, to be able to influence, negotiate, persuade, barter. That's one I'm going to come back to a bit later. Okay, so there are always competing issues. Politics, there's a lot of politics in universities, in case you aren't already aware of that. And career progression combined together make it very difficult to say no to things, but boundaries are also really important. And then the last point is that building teams for sustainable growth can be very complex because you're dealing with a lot of very, very intelligent people who have got very personalized motivations for doing what they want to be doing and are not necessarily easy to persuade to actually build a sustainable team. So it can be a very, very complicated environment. Question for you. Who's the leader in that picture? Anybody want to take a guess?
The yellow.
The yellow one.
At the back.
Yellow at the back. Okay.
Right.
Why yellow at the back?
Because he's shepherding everyone there.
Okay.
Here I am.
Yeah. That's a good enough reason and absolutely valid. Okay. Anybody else want to take another guess at who it might be?
Anyone.
Who said that? Yeah. Yeah, please.
Yeah, anyone really.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, anyone can be. Anybody want to? Yes, please. Okay, in the middle.
In the clump on the right.
Right.
In the middle of that.
Okay.
One that looks a bit different. Like
Okay, why?
because they're like immersing themselves amongst everyone and like gaining all the ideas and supporting from within instead of like, yeah,
That one. Okay.
that
Wow.
could be my eyes looking different.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, really good answers. Anybody else want to hazard another guess? Okay, we've got a couple at the back, yeah?
Red in the middle.
Red in the middle. Okay, why red? So that one. Yep.
Because next to them they seem to have a really big group.
Uh-huh.
And green in the middle might be the leader small group.
Okay.
And red's got a bigger group behind it, so they're the leader in general.
Fantastic. Okay. I hadn't noticed that either. Okay, great. And one more. I'm just going to take one more. Yep.
They're all leaders.
Okay.
All leading in their own thing.
Okay. Good answer. Okay. You're all right and you're all wrong. So I have no idea who the leader is in this picture. There's no right answer to this one. It's a little bit of a trick. It's a little bit of a trick question. Any of them could be the leader. This picture presents two things. And thank you actually, because I've never looked at it long enough myself, to be honest, to notice that the group on the left could be bigger than the one on the right, and that there is actually a tealy coloured one on the right. I hadn't noticed that before. This picture is just an interesting picture because actually any way you look at this picture, you can make up a story as to who the leader is in that picture. Because actually it's important to know why people are content to follow and why other people want to lead and the distinctions between the two. But if you actually happen to put leader or leadership into Amazon, for example, and look at the number of books on leadership, it comes back with hundreds of thousands of results, which tells you that there isn't one way to do this stuff that is the Holy Grail. We just don't have those kind of answers. So, unsurprisingly, there's no single agreed definition of leadership, what it is, what it encompasses, or how it differs from or is similar to management, okay? So I can't offer you that single definition. I'm going to offer you some thoughts today, and then actually what you need to do is to think about what your brand of leadership would look like for you and what would be important for you. So Rost found 221 definitions of leadership in 587 publications. We know that debates about leadership date back to ancient Greece and probably way, way back before that, because that's where we've got evidence, but actually in oral traditions, then people have probably been talking about it for much, much longer than that and have passed it down orally. However, when we talk about leadership in the literature, we are very keen to try and define it. We talk about behavioural aspects, we talk about contingency theories of leadership, we talk about, the situations that people need to find themselves in. But we rarely actually define what good leadership is. And that's because good leadership is very dependent on the person who is offering up the opinion, on their perspective. Okay, so a leader for one person can be a good leader, and a leader for another person can be a bad leader. So it's very perspective driven, and we have to be quite careful with that. It's also something I think very strongly that is a value-laden activity. And I think most of you are probably doing more leadership than you actually think you are. Okay, most of you are probably doing more leadership than you actually think you are. But one of the things that you need to do in order to move on with your career is to think about what that leadership looks like and to start to write some of this down in terms of evidence of when you've shown leadership. Okay, when you've influenced other people, when you've persuaded other people of your ideas, when you've taken people collectively in a group towards a single goal or towards a particular vision. And your research, I think, does a lot of that for a lot of you. Okay, this is kind of the boring stuff. This is what we teach. 6 theories of leadership that have really good traction in the leadership literature. And there's an historical sort of timeline to these. So they start with the great man theory, and it was men, okay? No women in that. Because in terms of the dating of that particular theory, it was looking at the hero model, the sort of the Winston Churchill model of leadership. But that leadership was almost always based on inheritance and survival of the fittest, and genetics and privilege played an enormous part in who was actually able to access those positions of leadership and to demonstrate those kinds of influence on other people. So the research has moved on quite considerably since then. So then we moved to trait theory, where the researchers basically said, well, then there must be traits that set leaders apart. And again, mostly men in that particular literature. We then move on to situating this in other ways. So we look at behaviours, which implies learnable behaviour rather than something that is just inherited and, it's just the luck of the draw as to who you're born to, where you're born, and, how you've grown up, as to whether you can actually become a leader or not. Behavioural theories implies learnable behaviour, and in fact, part of what we aim to do through leadership development programmes is to teach stuff around leadership. Now, some of that embraces some of the other theories of leadership that actually some of leadership is contingency based. It does depend on the circumstances and the fact that the person who emerges as the leader might be the product of some of those contexts, and whether they are successful or fail also depends on their situational context. There's obviously been a lot of research much more recently on women in leadership. And whereas most of you might be really familiar with the glass ceiling theory about women hitting a glass ceiling in organisations, you may be less familiar with the glass cliff theory of leadership, which is a very interesting leadership theory, which says that women were often appointed to positions of leadership in organisations where there had been a track record of poor management and where the company was actually already in some difficulty. And the kind of thinking behind that was, well, we've tried everything else, let's try a woman. And so they'd appoint a woman and then be, completely surprised and totally horrified when actually they were unable to turn the company around. And then women became labelled as a failure in leadership, and maybe leadership wasn't cut out for women. Have a Google of the glass cliff phenomenon, because it's a very interesting one, very well researched. Transactional leadership, that actually you are offering something to somebody, and transformational leadership, which is more akin to sort of a charismatic style of leadership where you're aiming to change things. Anyway, those are the 6 that have got real traction sort of in the literature. Doesn't mean you have to be one of those, doesn't mean you have to be the hero, that you have to be born into a particular position or anything of that nature. It doesn't mean you have to be charismatic even. All I'm just saying to you is that's what has traction in the literature as we have it. In fact, interestingly, there is a really, really good book by an academic at London Business School called Why Are So Many Inept Men Leaders, and What Are We Going to Do About It? I haven't got that quite right. Somebody can do a Google and have a look. Thomas Chamorro Perez, I think his name is. And he has the esteem of being the first man ever interviewed by Julia Gillard on her a podcast of one's own. So that's another link. You can have a look at that. It's a brilliant book, and I apologise for not actually referencing it properly here. But what he talks about is a lot of the characteristics that men display actually make them not suited for good leadership, for effective leadership. And part of that is to do with the charisma and the overconfidence. It makes them very appealing in an interview and appointment situation, but actually can signal failure for the company. So it's a really interesting, very well researched book, very readable as well if you fancy a delve into that. So there are other popular leadership theories, particularly in education, with reference to education. And one of the ones that we talk about quite a lot, as though we've kind of somehow nailed it, is distributed leadership, where we involve people in the decision making. And we refer to that in the higher education literature because universities used to have a much more collegiate approach to decision making and governance. So it used to be that essentially the professoriate ran the university and they would all come together and make decisions. It still happens in some universities, some of the very older, much more traditional ones. But most universities in the UK have had to move beyond that because we went through a process of enormous change in the 80s and 90s where we entered much more of a quasi-market environment and where we've had to adopt much more business-like practices for good or for ill. So we talk about distributed leadership in universities, but relatively few do it in the way that we used to do it. Okay, so some differences between leadership and management. Something that's not really distinguished in our universities, and I think is quite important. So leadership is much more about values, vision, strategy, encouraging people to come together to go in one direction. But management is much more about how we actually manage the day-to-day stuff, the operational stuff, the budgets, the people, that kind of thing. This is actually a graphic that I found that's quite good. Although I'm not overly keen on some of the stuff about the fact that managers use an authoritarian style and leaders have a motivational style, because I'm not sure that that holds true. But essentially, these are quotes from people who were in leadership positions that we interviewed. Leadership's not management, making it clear because the two terms are often used interchangeably and they're not the same. And then the second one, I think what's changed in higher education is the nature of leadership that's now much more like management and much more top-down than when I started. One word of advice to you in your careers. if you are offered a nice shiny ball of a leadership position within higher education, ask some questions around whether it's genuinely leadership or whether actually it's management. Because a lot of the positions that people step into are actually very management. And you will then find yourselves doing a lot of people management, a lot of budget management, and that will be your sort of day-to-day bread and butter. Now, be very clear that that's absolutely fine if that's what you want to do. And in interviewing the heads of department, we found that a lot of them did want to do that. A significant proportion were happy to do that. They wanted to progress in university administration. But be very clear about whether that suits you or not. And that's why the values exercise is quite a useful one. Now, by and large, and this is a very sort of broad brush, most universities are organised at the institutional level. You've got the university, and then you've got some kind of a large grouping, which may be known as a college, a faculty, or a school. And then you've got smaller subgroups that come under those. So you may be in a department, a division, and then you may actually be in a research group that is in a department. And that's roughly how the structures work. They're all different. I've put Brunel's up there because it was obviously just easier. And size of institution makes a big difference as well. So you will find you will have more or less of the larger subgroupings depending on your size of institution. Within that, there are then typical positions that people take on, usually for a fixed term of some kind. So you might be familiar with sort of head of research group, head of department, but then you may not be so aware of positions like director of education or director of research within a department, or director of student experience, which was one I held for a couple of years in my department, undergraduate, taught postgraduate director. There are school faculty, the larger subgrouping positions as well, Vice Dean Education or Dean of College, and institutional positions. That's when you're right at the very top, when you're talking about the top tier or the second tier down of the institution, where your purview is across the institution. And that's obviously the Vice Chancellor or President, depending on where you are. And then things like the Deputy Vice Chancellor or Provost or PVC Education or PVC Research. So those are some of the formal positions. And if you work in academia, you know, if you're on the academic side, then all of those positions are open to you. So you can progress into those positions. And most of them now are on a fixed term nature. And the majority of universities will advertise those at least internally. Some will advertise externally as well. So you can choose to progress up that clear hierarchy if you so wish. The thing to be aware of is that responsibilities and authority with those positions will vary. So you will be likely to have some kind of resource management. Whether that is strategic and leadership focused or whether it's actually just about managing the everyday budget may well depend at what level you do those kind of positions. And then you may also have responsibility for delivering on key targets, the National Student Survey, and you may have responsibility for leading on things like sort of NSS or the REF or that kind of thing. But there is this leadership stuff that is done by a lot of people who are not in line management positions and positions of authority. And that's where you can go if you don't want to be so bogged down with the line management of other people and the management of budgets. So think about behaviour, not position. Think about where you are already demonstrating leadership in your current position. Are there things in your lab that need organising and no one else is doing them? Are you stepping up to that? Are you able to do that? You're probably more able to do those kinds of things than you think you are. You're probably sitting there, some of you, waiting for somebody else to take up leadership in these areas because you think you don't have the authority to do it. Whereas actually a lot of stuff in academia needs to happen by people who don't have, quote unquote, that formal authority. What about writing groups, seminar sessions? Have you organised any of those? Are they just passed down, from one postdoc to another? Or do you just not have anything like that? What about the networks that you formed yesterday, from this retreat? How can you keep those going? Because those are very demonstrable evidence of leadership, okay? So you can step up to these things. How do you contribute your views in meetings? Do you just sit there and just let everybody else dominate the meetings? Or do you actually take a part and offer your views in those meetings? Academia is about having an opinion, allowing others to critique that opinion for sure, and that's something, we all have to live with in academia. Sometimes it's not so nice, sometimes it's okay. But you can have your opinion, okay? You have a voice, and it's important for your voices to be heard. So do think about how you are negotiating and working with others, how you're leading on things, how you're demonstrating leadership in your research area, how you might have persuaded people round to your way of actually doing things in your research. Perhaps they wanted to do this protocol and you've suggested that actually this one would be better and they've agreed. That's how you're demonstrating leadership. So think about where you might want to go in the future and how you might be demonstrating leadership now to get there. Okay, I'm not going to talk through this because this is something you can read in the slides. They're going to upload the slides, I think, to the app. And this is the Cousins and Posner 5 practices and 10 commitments of exemplary leadership, which is very grand. But there's some good stuff in this about, modelling the way, inspiring others, enabling other people to act. Things that don't necessarily require you to be in that position of line management authority. Okay, put some other comments in there, but again, these are things that you can read about, I think, at another point. So I'm going to go through some of this. One of the things I would really like you to do after this retreat is over is to think about your values and how you live your values. Now, research often attracts us because we feel passionately about something, and that's a value. So particularly in terms of some of the research that you are doing that is sponsored by the Alzheimer Society, I'm imagining that some of you are doing that for very personal reasons, and that's a value. That's something that's really important to you. But have a think about some of your other values and how you show those, because people who are clear about their values show leadership. They are very, very clear about that. They're clear about what they believe in. They're clear about what's important to them. And they bring other people with them. It's like a magnet. And so it's worth spending some time early in your career to think about what's really important to you and about then where you can go from there. Okay. Now, I've put some stuff in here about motivation. I'm not going to go through this because some of you will be quite familiar with it. And this is about motivation theory. It's put in there because it's useful for you to have a look at and to be aware of in terms of working with other people. But just to be aware that other people are motivated by things that might be different from what motivates you. So your passion for researching into dementia might not be the same as other people's passions. Other people might have other passions. They might have other motivations. They might be really passionate about the need for good Wi-Fi, for example. Okay, it's a joke. But actually, it's interesting stuff. And the one thing that Hertzberg did research into was actually that money doesn't motivate people as much as you think it does. The absence of it motivates people, but actually there's kind of a level at which people are not motivated by salary. There's been quite a lot of research into that. And then McClelland looked at achievement, the need to achieve things, the need to have goals and achieve your goals, the need for affiliation, the need for belonging, and the need for power. And though the balance of those motivates people in different ways, and we're all quite unique about that. And then that's some stuff about situational. Okay. So another thing for you to think about is what the environment is like that you are working in your university. So there will be things that are actually rewarded in your university, and then there will be things that they will tell you are rewarded. And there can be quite a difference between the two, but it's worth having a look at the promotions criteria in your institution, and most institutions make those fairly freely available through HR web pages and the like. Have a look at what it takes to progress from lecturer to senior lecturer to reader, reader to prof, and so on. And you'll start to get an idea of what's actually rewarded within your institutions. And that sort of reward will help you to think about where you might want to go in your university and in your career. I'm going to skip through this a little bit, just to get through to some of the quotes right at the end here. So this is about sort of what some of the people we interviewed said leadership was really like. So some of them said, it's really difficult to take on one of those roles that I talked about and be a researcher, but it's almost unavoidable to, you almost have to take on a management role as you move up. And certainly that speaks to a lot of people in universities. People struggling with how to balance the amount of work that there is to do and the need to do research and the need for other responsibilities as well. How to set boundaries, how to protect time. And that's kind of a similar one, is that what systems have you got in place to manage the workload that's in front of you? And then there is this thing about understanding how the sector works and what's important. So we've just exited from a ref cycle, and we're just starting to gear up for the next one, which is going to be 2028, I think. And we're just starting to understand what's going to be needed for that ref cycle. And that's an important time to engage with those discussions in your university if you're thinking about progressing. And then the other thing that I mentioned earlier is the barter economy. So what can I offer to you and what can you offer back to me? That's not, I'm in a line management position and I'm going to make you do it because I've told you to. That's actually about understanding what different people have to offer to each other, and what, if I do something for you, you'll do something for me in return a little bit later. Far more in academia works on those lines than it does actually in terms of I'm the line manager and I'm telling you what to do. Okay, I'm just going to kind of skip over that because that talks about head of department. The other thing to bear in mind is that some of these positions are indeed a privilege, and that it's a privilege to be able to influence things in your university, in your research area, and all of you are already doing that in terms of your research already. Some things to think about for you to go forwards are about whether you've got access to mentors, your networks, what matters to you, and also starting to think about where you want to be in 5 to 10 years' time. And do also think about how you are with navigating institutional politics, because if that doesn't appeal to you, then certainly the formal positions are probably not going to be your bag. And there's not anything wrong with that at all. But the most important thing is to be clear about what is your bag and what's not early on, so that you can avoid being really miserable in a formal position of authority and not being great at it either, because that's not what any of us want. Okay, that's the resource I referred to earlier. Those are the references. I hope that's been a bit of a useful gander. And the last thing is, when Sophie contacted me, I said to her, I really want to make this work. This was quite a difficult day for me to come up and do this because I've got so much going on and I've been away on holiday and I only got back Sunday night. This is my mother-in-law. This was my mother-in-law. And she had dementia and she died in April 2020 in South Africa in a care home, and we couldn't be there because of COVID. So what you are all doing is immensely important to me and to us as a family. So I just wanted to sort of just finish on that note. Thank you all very much.